When I was 12, my mom died. It wasn't one of those things you saw coming, like a long illness where you get time to say goodbye. One moment, I was sitting in the back seat of her car, complaining about homework, and the next, I was waking up in a hospital bed with no idea what had happened. They told me there had been an accident. The nurse was kind, soft-spoken, but her words didn't make sense at first. When she said, "Your mother didn't make it," I thought she meant we'd missed an appointment. It took me days to understand she wasn't coming back. My brothers, Eric and Matt, were at the hospital when I was discharged. Eric was 23, busy with his new job at a marketing firm, and Matt, at 19, was just starting college. I thought, maybe now that Mom was gone, they'd step up. They were my family, after all. But the looks on their faces told me otherwise. Eric wouldn't meet my eyes, and Matt kept fidgeting with his phone like he had somewhere more important to be. We buried Mom on a rainy Tuesday. I remember standing there in my ill-fitting suit, staring at the casket while everyone else whispered their condolences. I kept waiting for Eric or Matt to say something, anything, about what was going to happen next. But all they did was talk to some of Mom's old friends about arrangements. That was how I learned I wasn't going home with either of them. The social worker, Miss Price, showed up a few days later. She was friendly in that practiced way people in her job are, all sympathetic smiles and soothing tones. "We're going to find you a good home," she said. I wanted to ask why I couldn't just stay with Eric or Matt, but I already knew the answer. Eric said he wasn't ready to raise a kid, and Matt claimed he couldn't balance school and taking care of me. They both made it sound so reasonable, like they were doing what was best for everyone. The night before I left, Eric came to my room. He handed me a duffel bag and told me to pack my things. "It's just until they find a better situation for you," he said. His voice clipped like he wanted the conversation to be over as quickly as possible. I didn't argue. What was the point? The first foster home wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. The Callahans were nice enough, but it was clear I was just another responsibility they had to manage. They fed me, gave me a bed, and asked about school sometimes, but there was no warmth. They had 2 daughters, both teenagers, who ignored me unless they were making fun of my hair or the way I talked. I spent most of my time in my room, flipping through the photo album I'd brought with me. It was one of the few things I had left of Mom, a small, leather-bound book filled with pictures of birthdays, holidays, and random moments that didn't seem important at the time but now felt priceless. Eric and Matt called a few times in those first months. I'd get my hopes up every time I saw the number pop up on the screen, thinking maybe they'd change their minds. But the conversations were always short and awkward. "How's school?" Eric would ask, his tone distant. "Are they treating you okay?" Matt would chime in, but his voice sounded more like he was ticking a box than actually caring about the answer. One time, I worked up the courage to ask Eric why he didn't take me in. He sighed, like the question was exhausting. "I just wasn't in a place to do it," he said. "I was starting a new job, and I didn't think I'd be able to give you what you needed." I didn't ask again. By the time I turned 14, I'd learned not to expect much from them. The calls became less frequent, eventually stopping altogether. I told myself I didn't care, but every birthday or holiday felt like a slap in the face. The people who were supposed to love me the most had decided I wasn't worth the effort. When I was 15, I moved to a new foster home. The Bakers were different from the others. They weren't perfect, but they tried. Mrs. Baker had a warm laugh that made you feel like you belonged, and Mr. Baker treated me like I was one of his own kids, even though I knew I wasn't. They had 2 younger boys, and while we weren't exactly close, they didn't go out of their way to make me feel like an outsider. For the first time in years, I felt a little bit of stability. But even then, the bitterness never fully went away. Every time I thought about Eric or Matt, I felt this knot in my stomach, a mix of anger and sadness that I didn't know how to get rid of. I told myself I didn't need them, that I was better off without them. And maybe I was. But some nights, lying awake in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder why they hadn't fought for me. What was so wrong with me that they decided I wasn't worth it? When I turned 18, the Bakers sat me down for a conversation I'd been dreading for months. "We know you're ready to start your own life," Mrs. Baker said, her voice kind but cautious, like she didn't want to push me too hard. "But you're welcome to stay with us until you figure things out." I wanted to say yes. They weren't my family, not really, but they were the closest thing I'd had in years. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just another obligation. Another kid they'd taken in because they were kind-hearted and responsible. I didn't want to be anyone's burden anymore. "Thank you," I said, forcing a smile. "But I think I need to be on my own." They didn't argue. Mr. Baker just nodded and said, "If you ever need anything, you know where to find us." I moved out 2 weeks later, packing up my few belongings into a second-hand duffel bag. It felt eerily similar to the day I left my childhood home, except this time, I had a little bit of control. I'd saved some money from part-time jobs and had found a cheap studio apartment on the edge of town. The building wasn't much: peeling paint, creaky floors, and a landlord who barely spoke English, but it was mine. The first few months were tough. I picked up shifts at a diner, cleaning tables and washing dishes until my hands were raw. The pay was lousy, and my boss was the kind of guy who liked to bark orders just to feel important. But it was a job, and it kept me afloat. Some nights, after long shifts, I'd sit in my tiny apartment and think about everything that had happened. Eric and Matt never crossed my mind during the day, but at night, when the city got quiet, they'd sneak back in. I'd wonder if they ever thought about me, if they ever regretted what they'd done. The bitterness I'd carried for years hadn't disappeared. It had just buried itself deeper. One night, after a particularly rough day at work, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hey, it's Matt. I hope you're doing okay. Let me know if you ever want to catch up." I stared at the message for a long time, my stomach twisting. It had been years since I'd heard from him. The last time we spoke, I was still a kid, begging him to explain why he wouldn't take me in. Now, out of nowhere, he wanted to catch up? I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the message and went to bed, hoping I could push it out of my mind. But Matt wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, he sent a handful of texts, each one more insistent than the last. "I'd really like to see you. We need to talk. Please don't ignore me. I'm trying here." I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't know what he wanted, but I wasn't ready to find out. Then, one day, I got another text, this time from Eric. "Hey, it's been a while. I know we've got a lot to talk about. Let me know when you're free." It felt like a punch to the gut. Why were they suddenly so interested in my life? Where had this urgency been when I was 12, sitting alone in a strange house with strangers who barely looked at me? I tried to ignore it, but the messages kept coming. Matt called a few times, but I let it go to voicemail. Each time, he left a message saying the same thing: "I just want to talk. Okay? Please call me back." One day, I came home from work to find a letter slipped under my apartment door. The handwriting was messy, but I recognized it immediately. It was Matt's. Inside was a short note. "I know I've messed up. We both did. But I can't stop thinking about you, about everything we should have done differently. Please, let's talk. If you don't want to, I'll stop bothering you. But if you change your mind, here's my number." I crumpled the note in my hand and threw it in the trash. But later that night, I found myself fishing it out again. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to call him, to scream at him for all the years he'd left me wondering why I wasn't good enough. Another part of me wanted to pretend I'd never seen the note, to keep them locked away in the past where they belonged. I stayed up late, staring at the ceiling, the note crumpled in my fist. For years, I told myself they didn't matter, that I didn't need them. But if that was true, why couldn't I let this go? Eventually, I made a decision. I grabbed my phone, found Matt's number, and typed out a message. "We can talk, but I'm not making any promises." I hit send before I could change my mind. Matt responded almost immediately. His reply was short but careful, like he didn't want to scare me off. "Thank you. Let me know when and where, and I'll be there." I spent the next day going back and forth on whether I'd made a mistake. Did I really want to open that door again? Did I want to give him and Eric the chance to hurt me all over? The logical part of me said no. But there was a smaller, quieter voice that kept whispering maybe. Maybe they'd changed. Maybe this time would be different. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in a neighborhood far enough from my apartment that I wouldn't feel exposed. I arrived early, nursing a cup of tea I didn't even like, my hands shaking as I checked the time over and over. I had no idea what I was going to say. Matt showed up right on time. He looked older, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before and a slightly slouched posture, like life had taken a toll on him. He spotted me near the back and hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Hey," he said, sitting across from me. "Hey," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. For a moment, neither of us said anything. He fiddled with the cardboard sleeve on his coffee cup while I stared at the table, trying to gather my thoughts. Finally, he broke the silence. "Thanks for agreeing to this," he said. "I wasn't sure if you'd even read my letter." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But here we are." He nodded, his eyes downcast. "Look, I know this is long overdue, and I don't even know where to start. But I'm sorry. For everything. For not being there when you needed me. For not fighting harder to keep us together." I didn't say anything, letting his words hang in the air. They sounded genuine, but I wasn't ready to let him off the hook that easily. "Why now?" I asked. "Why after all these years?" Matt sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you. About what we did. I tried to convince myself that we were doing what was best for you back then, but that was just an excuse. We were scared. I was scared. I didn't know how to take care of you, and instead of figuring it out, I let you down." "Yeah, you did," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "You both did, and I'm the one who had to live with it." "I know," he said quietly, "and I hate that we put you through that, but I want to make it right, if I can. I know I can't change the past, but maybe we can start fresh. Maybe we can try to be a family again." His words hit me harder than I expected. A family. It was something I'd wanted for so long, but now that it was being offered, I didn't know how to feel. Could I trust him? Could I trust any of this? "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally. "I don't even know if I want to." Matt nodded, his expression pained but understanding. "That's fair. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I just want a chance to prove that I've changed. That I'm not the same person who let you down back then." We talked for a little while longer, but the conversation didn't get much deeper. I could tell he was holding back, afraid of saying the wrong thing. And honestly, I was holding back too. I didn't trust him enough to let him in completely, not yet. Before we parted ways, Matt said something that stuck with me. "Eric wants to talk to you too. He's the one who pushed me to reach out in the first place. He's been struggling with this as much as I have." I scoffed. Eric was always good at keeping his struggles to himself. That's part of the problem. Matt didn't argue. He just gave me a small, sad smile and said, "He's trying too. If you're open to it, I think it'd mean a lot to him." After he left, I sat in the coffee shop for a long time, staring out the window and replaying the conversation in my head. It wasn't what I expected. I thought I'd feel angrier, or maybe relieved, but instead, I just felt tired. I wasn't sure what to do next. Matt had said all the right things, but words were easy. Actions were harder, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out if they meant what they said. That night, I got a text from Eric. It was simple. "Matt told me you two talked. I'd like to see you too, if you're open to it." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Let me think about it." And for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't just thinking about what they owed me. I was thinking about what I wanted. It took me 2 weeks to decide whether I wanted to meet Eric. I kept telling myself I was too busy to deal with it. Long shifts at the diner, bills to pay, errands to run. But the truth was, I was stalling. Talking to Matt had stirred up emotions I hadn't felt in years, and I wasn't sure I could handle another round. One night after work, as I sat in my apartment eating instant noodles and scrolling aimlessly on my phone, I finally made up my mind. I sent Eric a message. "Fine. Let's meet. Same place I met Matt." He responded almost immediately. "Thank you. Just let me know when works for you." We set a time for the next afternoon. I wasn't nervous exactly, but there was a weight in my chest I couldn't shake. I didn't know what I wanted from this meeting. Closure? Answers? A way to tell him off? Maybe all of the above. Eric was already at the coffee shop when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a coffee in front of him. He looked different from how I remembered. Older, of course, but there was something else. A stiffness in his posture, like he was carrying something heavy he couldn't put down. "Hey," he said when I sat down, his voice quieter than I expected. "Hey," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. For a moment, we just sat there, neither of us knowing how to start. He took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down carefully, as if he were afraid of breaking it. I don't really know where to start, he admitted. Matt said you two talked, and I'm glad. I'm glad he reached out. Yeah, he reached out, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Took him long enough. Took both of you long enough. Eric winced but didn't argue. You're right, he said. We should have reached out sooner. We should have done a lot of things differently. Like not abandoning me? I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. Yeah, like that. I wanted to keep going, to lay into him for all the years of silence, all the times I'd wondered why I wasn't enough for him to care. But the defeated look on his face stopped me. For the first time, he didn't look like the confident, put-together older brother I remembered. He looked broken. I've thought about that day a lot, he said after a moment. The day we decided to send you to foster care. I thought we were doing the right thing. I told myself you'd be better off with someone who knew how to take care of you. But the truth is, I was scared. I was in over my head, and I took the easy way out. And I've regretted it ever since. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to believe him, but another part of me wasn't ready to let go of the anger I'd held onto for so long. Why didn't you ever check in? I asked. You said you'd visit, but you didn't. You barely even called. He nodded, his jaw tightening. I know. Every time I thought about reaching out, I felt like it was too late, like I'd already failed you, and nothing I said would make a difference. But that was selfish. I let my guilt stop me from being there for you, and I'm sorry for that. His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For the first time, I felt like he was being completely honest with me. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said, meeting my eyes. I just want a chance to be part of your life again. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the table, trying to sort through the mess of emotions swirling in my head. After a while, he spoke again. I know it's going to take time, and I know I can't undo the damage I've done, but I'm willing to put in the work, if you'll let me. I nodded slowly, still unsure of what I wanted, but willing to give him a chance. We'll see, I said, but don't expect things to go back to the way they were. It's going to take more than an apology. I understand, he said, a small glimmer of hope in his eyes. We talked for a little while longer, about nothing in particular. It was awkward, but it wasn't as unbearable as I thought it would be. When we finally parted ways, I felt lighter, not entirely at peace, but like a small part of the weight I'd been carrying for so long had shifted. That night, I found myself replaying the conversation in my head. Eric had seemed sincere, but I wasn't sure if I could trust him yet. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild overnight. It would take time, and I wasn't sure if we had enough of it. Still, for the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. The days after meeting Eric were strange. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, how he looked so different from the brother I remembered. For years, I'd built up this version of him in my head, cold, selfish, and uninterested in anything that wasn't about him. But sitting across from him at that coffee shop, I saw cracks in that image. He didn't seem cold. He seemed regretful. He didn't seem selfish. He seemed ashamed. It messed with me. I wasn't used to thinking of Eric or Matt as real people with their own struggles. In my mind, they were always the ones who let me down, who left me to figure things out on my own. But now I was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than I wanted to admit. Eric started texting me more often after our meeting. Nothing heavy, just little check-ins. Hope work's going okay. Did you see that game last night? Let me know if you need anything. I didn't always reply, but I didn't block him either. It was tolerable. Matt, on the other hand, was more straightforward. He called one night while I was cooking dinner and said, "We're getting together for dinner at Eric's this weekend. You should come." The idea of sitting in a room with both of them made my stomach turn, but I didn't want to say no outright. I don't know, I said, stirring the pot of instant ramen on my stove. That sounds like a lot. It doesn't have to be, Matt said. Just come for an hour. If it's too much, you can leave. No pressure. I sighed, torn between the part of me that wanted to avoid them altogether and the part that felt like I owed it to myself to at least try. Fine, I said. 1 hour. That Saturday, I showed up at Eric's apartment. It was nicer than I expected, clean, organized, with a couple of framed photos on the wall. I recognized one of them instantly, a picture of us as kids, sitting on the beach with Mom in the middle, her arms wrapped around all three of us. Hey, Eric said, opening the door and stepping aside to let me in. Thanks for coming. Yeah, I said, not meeting his eyes. Matt was already in the kitchen, setting the table. He grinned when he saw me. You made it. Don't make a big deal out of it, I muttered, but he just laughed. Dinner was weird. They were trying, I'll give them that, but it was awkward. Eric kept asking about work, and Matt told a couple of stories about his students, but every topic felt like it was tiptoeing around something bigger. At one point, Matt brought out a bottle of wine and poured us each a glass. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass. I hesitated for a moment before clinking mine against his. After dinner, Eric disappeared into the bedroom and came back holding a small box. He set it on the table in front of me. I found this when I was cleaning out some of Mom's old things. I thought you might want it. I opened the box and froze. Inside were a few of Mom's keepsakes, a pair of earrings she used to wear every Sunday, a pressed flower bookmark she'd made for me, and a handwritten note that simply said, I love you. My throat tightened, and I quickly closed the box. Why didn't you tell me you had this? Eric rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't know how. After she died, everything felt complicated. I wasn't sure if you'd want it, or if it would just make things harder. You decided that for me? I said, my voice sharp. Matt jumped in. He was trying to do what he thought was best. It wasn't the right call, but we're trying to make it right now. I sat back in my chair, staring at the box. The anger I felt was real, but so was the gratitude. For years, I'd thought all these little pieces of Mom were gone, lost forever. Now, here they were, right in front of me. Thanks, I said finally, my voice quiet. You don't have to forgive us, Eric said. Not for this, not for anything. We just want to be here, however you'll let us. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. When I left that night, the box was tucked under my arm. I walked back to my apartment feeling more conflicted than ever. They were trying, and that meant something, but it didn't erase what had happened. Could I let them back in? Did I even want to? As I unlocked my door, I caught a glimpse of the photo album sitting on my bookshelf. Maybe it was time to stop living in the past. Maybe it was time to start figuring out what the future could look like. The box sat on my kitchen counter for a few days before I could bring myself to open it again. Every time I walked past, I'd glance at it, feeling a strange mix of emotions, grief, anger, even a little hope. Finally, one quiet evening, I sat down at the table, turned on the lamp, and lifted the lid. The earrings caught the light, just like they used to when Mom wore them. I picked up the bookmark, running my fingers over the pressed flowers, and for a moment, I could almost hear her voice telling me to keep it safe. But it was the note that undid me. The ink was faded, and the paper was worn at the edges. But the words were clear, I love you, always. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear smudged the corner of the note. All the memories I'd buried came rushing back. Her laugh, her hugs, the way she'd always find time to sit with me no matter how busy she was. And then, right behind those memories, came the ones I'd been trying to forget. The hospital, the funeral, Eric and Matt walking away when I needed them most. I wiped my face and set the note back in the box. It was too much to process all at once, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep living in this limbo. I had to decide what kind of relationship I wanted with Eric and Matt, if any. A few days later, Matt texted me. Game night at Eric's. Want to join? I stared at the message for a while, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Finally, I typed back, sure. What time? Eric's apartment felt less intimidating the second time. When I walked in, Matt was already setting up a board game on the coffee table, and Eric was in the kitchen, pulling snacks out of the cupboard. They greeted me like I'd been there 100 times before. No awkwardness, no heavy conversations. We played a few rounds of a game I barely remembered from when we were kids. Eric won the first round, Matt cheated in the second, and somehow, I came out on top in the third. For the first time in years, I found myself laughing with them, the kind of genuine, easy laughter I hadn't felt in forever. At one point, Eric stepped away to grab more drinks, leaving Matt and me alone in the living room. "You seem more relaxed," he said, shuffling the cards. I shrugged. "Maybe I am." He hesitated before speaking again. "I know it's been a long road to get here, and I know we've still got a lot to prove. But I just want you to know, I'm really glad you're here." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Over the next few months, things started to feel normal. Not perfect, not like the happy family we used to be, but something new. Eric and Matt made an effort to stay in my life, not just through texts and phone calls, but through real, consistent actions. Eric helped me fix the leaky faucet in my apartment, and Matt started inviting me to his weekend hikes. I still had moments of doubt, moments when the resentment bubbled up and I'd question whether I was doing the right thing. But each time, they showed up. They didn't try to push or rush me. They just kept showing up. One weekend, we all went back to the beach where that old photo of us with Mom had been taken. It wasn't planned. Eric had mentioned he was heading there to clear his head, and Matt suggested we all go together. Standing there, looking out at the waves, I felt something shift. I couldn't quite name it, but it was like the weight I'd been carrying all these years had finally started to lift. "You think Mom would be proud of us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Matt looked at me, surprised by the question. "Of course she would. She'd be proud of you most of all." Eric nodded. "She'd be proud of all of us. For trying." And in that moment, I realized that trying was enough. We weren't perfect, and we never would be, but we were here, together. It wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about finding a way to move forward, even if it was messy and complicated. As the sun set over the water, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay.